Envy slayeth the silly. You see, that's a title I gave this message today. I was reading through chapter 5 of Job here, and I came across that phrase, and it made me kind of chuckle. And I thought, there's a good title. It'll get some attention. But it does make a point, and it comes from Job's friend Eliphaz, who we heard last week has been somewhat deceived by a spirit, likely Satan, who came to him to give him advice to give Job and deceive him. And we're going to go through 5 through 7 here, basically. Not every verse, but most of it, and just talk about it here. All right? So continuing on in our study of the book of Job, we find ourselves in chapter 5. And after hearing Job wail and moan and cry in chapter 3, we then listen to some spiritual deception from Satan through one of Job's friends named Eliphaz in chapter 4. And as we enter chapter 5, Eliphaz is now saying to Job in verse 1, "Call now, if there be any that will answer you, and to which of the saints will thou turn?" Well, it sounds like in those days there may have been those who had already developed some saints that they were turning to in time of trouble. Who is the patron saint for boils on your body, for example, that you're going to pray to? All right. It goes on to say, "For wrath killeth the foolish, and envy slayeth the silly. I have seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I cursed his habitation. His children are far from safety, and they are crushed in the gate. Neither is there any to deliver them." So now he's accusing Job here of foolishness and silliness and all of that. And you see, Job's children were crushed when their house fell during a storm. Back in verse 1 we read that. So Eliphaz is saying, I've seen the foolish people and all, and their children get crushed in the gate, just like yours did. "Whose harvest the hungry eateth up, and taketh it even out of the thorns, and the robber swalloweth up their substance." Well, back in chapter 1, again, the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans had come in and stolen everything that Job had, and killed his servants and taken everything. So Eliphaz is trying to make it all applicable to Job, saying, this is what happened to you. You're the foolish one, and you had taken root, but suddenly you're cursed. Envy slayeth the silly. Who are you jealous of? He's asking. That must be the problem. What are you, a simpleton or something? He goes on in verse 6 saying, "Although affliction comes not forth of the dust, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground. Yet man is born unto trouble, as the sparks fly upward." That's a great philosophy for life there, isn't it? I mean, he's saying, man, you were born for trouble, just like the sparks who fly upward. But unfortunately, it sort of seems to be the case here. And he continues and advises Job, "I would seek unto God, and unto God would I commit my cause, which doeth great things and unsearchable marvelous things without number. Who giveth rain upon the earth, and sendeth waters upon the fields, to set up on high those that be low, and those which mourn may be exalted to safety. He disappointeth the devices of the crafty, so that their hands cannot perform their enterprise. He taketh the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the froward is carried headlong," he says. Now that word froward is the opposite of toward or toward. And basically it means perverted or contrary. He says they meet with darkness in the daytime and grope in the noonday as in the night. But he saves the poor from the sword, from their mouth, and from the hand of the mighty. So the poor hath hope, and iniquity stoppeth her mouth. Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty, as we heard in the other scriptures. And Solomon, no doubt, was familiar with Job, because in his advice to his son, which we read from chapter 3 of Proverbs, he said, My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be thou weary with his correction. And of course, Paul picked it up in the New Testament. Paul, or whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, I think it was Paul, but whoever wrote the book of Hebrews picks it up and it says, My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord. And happy is everyone who is scourged by him. So here in Job 5, Eliphaz says, hey, don't despise God's chastening. Happy is the man whom God corrects. Don't despise the chastening of the Almighty. Be happy about what's happening to you, brother. Yeah, right. For he makes sore and bindeth up. He woundeth, and his hands make whole. He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles. Yea, in 7 there shall no evil touch thee. And he doesn't really list 7 troubles here. He just speaks of a few. He says, God will spare you in the time of famine. In famine he will redeem thee from death, and in war from the power of the sword. Thou shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue, neither shalt thou be afraid of destruction when it cometh. So he's given 4 of those 7 things he mentioned. He doesn't really tell us the other 3. He comes back to destruction and famine, but he does say, thou shalt laugh, neither shalt thou be afraid of the beasts of the earth. So I guess that's 5. And then chapter 23 goes on to say, for thou shalt be in league with the stones of the field, and the beasts of the field shall be at peace with thee. And thou shalt know that thy tabernacle shall be in peace. And thou shalt visit thy habitation, and shalt not sin. Thou shalt know also that thy seed shall be great, and thine offspring as the grass of the earth. Thou shalt come to thy grave in the full age, like as a shock of corn cometh in its season. Lo, this we have searched it, so it is. Hear it, and know it for your own good. He's saying, so here's the way it is, Job. This is the way the cow eats its cabbage, or something like this. Listen to me for your own good. Just get right with God, man, is what he's saying. That's all you need. And he asserts it really confidently, almost arrogantly, really. So that evil spirit that visited him before must have really impressed him with that deceptive message. And he thought he was conveying divinely inspired advice to Job. So he was going on and on. And as we shall see later, he convinced his other friends, Bildad and Zophar, that this was a message they should give to him too. And in chapter 6, Job responds to him and he says, oh, that my grief were thoroughly weighed, and my calamities laid in the balances together. You need to picture this. In those days, the balances, the scales that they used in the market, always had little weights that they put on one side, and then they would take whatever you're buying, like grapes or whatever, on the other side, and until they balanced. And when the balance came to be equal, say if you were buying the amount of the weight of a talent, then you'd have a talent worth of grapes and you'd pay for that. So think of balances like that. And he says, oh, that my calamities, my griefs were laid in the balance. They would be heavier than the sands of the sea. So you picture all of the sands of the sea and put them on one side of the balance, and then on the other side, you pour all of Job's calamities and grief until it balances up. I think he's exaggerating a little bit here. He's saying, oh, that would be heavier than all the sands of the sea. Well, it's poetic too. But therefore my words are swallowed up, for the arrows of the Almighty are within me. The poison whereof drinketh up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me. Does the wild donkey bray when he hath grass? Or does the ox loweth over his fodder? Can that which is unsavory be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? The things that my soul refused to touch are as my sorrowful meat. Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would just grant me the thing that I long for. Verse 8. Okay, Job, so what is it that you long for, right? Well, he says, even that it would please God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. Poor old Job. I mean, he's really in desperate straits here. He's saying, I just wish God would grant me my request, the thing that I long for. And it's just that I be dead, that I be cut off. I can't stand life anymore. And I'm sure that all of us have come to situations in our own lives that are so unsavory, so distasteful, that we've had some of these same thoughts pass through our minds. Mm-hmm. Oh, that God would grant me my desire. And yet, I don't think that we always think these thoughts through sincerely, do we? I mean, I think a lot of times we say, oh, I just wish I were dead, but don't really necessarily mean it, right? It's kind of like the fellow who was carrying his heavy load on a hot day and finally came up to the river, and he just sort of collapsed exhausted and set the load down. And sitting there by the river, he said, I'm just so tired I could die. Death, please, death, come. And then he felt a tap on his shoulder, and he looked up, and it was death. And it said, did you call me? And he said, yes, I'd just like you to help me pick up this pack so I can get going on my way again, okay? See, we don't always mean what we say when we call for death or wish it was all over, right? But we do feel that way sometimes. You know, at least for the moment of despair. And Job is expressing that here himself, even though he still doesn't know what death is all about, as God tells him later. Mm-hmm. For if I were destroyed, he says, then should I yet have comfort. Yes, I would harden myself in sorrow. Let him not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One. Well, Job apparently had access somehow to words of the Holy One, either by direct inspiration or possibly through some ancient scriptures, which we read later were only for the ages before the call of Moses. See that in Job 23. Verse 10 of 6, he says, what is my strength that I should hope? And what is mine end that I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh of brass? Is not my help in me, and is wisdom driven quite from me? Now he's talking to Eliphaz, responding to the whole speech that he just heard from him. And in verse 14 he says, to him that is afflicted, pity should be showed from his friend. Saying, look man, I need pity. I don't need someone to come up and jump on my case at this point. I need pity, not pious poetry. And then Job continues in pious poetry, saying, my brethren have dealt deceitfully as a brook, and as the streams of brooks they pass away, which are blackish by reason of the ice, and wherein the snow is hid. What time they wax warm, they vanish. When it is hot, they are consumed out of their place. So again, this is picturesque poetry here, and so it's meant to be imagery. And he's just saying, my friends are like ice or snow. They appear to be friends, but when things get hot, they melt. They don't exist. I've had those kind of friends, have you? They're called fair weather friends, right? And when things get hot, you'll never find them. Right? The paths of their way are turned aside. They go to nothing and perish. Skipping down to verse 21, he says, for now you are nothing. You see my casting down, and you are afraid. Did I say unto you, come to me? Give me a reward of your substance, or deliver me from the enemy's hand? Redeem me from the hand of the mighty? So Job's saying to Eliphaz, look man, did I ask you to come around here? Did I ask you for anything? Don't help me anymore. I don't need what you're giving me. I'm tired of you. I didn't ask you for anything. I didn't say, please give me something. I didn't call for you. I don't need to hear this. But then he says in verse 24, teach me, and I will hold my tongue. Tell me something that's worthwhile, and I'll be quiet, he says. You haven't told me anything worthwhile and caused me to understand where I've erred, where I've made a mistake. So Job repeatedly emphasizes his willingness to confess and forsake any sin in his life if someone would tell him specifically what it was, instead of just condemning him in generalities like he keeps hearing here. How forcible are right words? But what doth your arguing reprove? Do you imagine to reprove words in the speeches of one that is desperate, which are as wind? He's saying, you're just a bag of wind, man. Eliphaz, you don't have anything to say of any value. That's what he's saying. Yeah, you overwhelm the fatherless, and you dig a pit for your friend. Now, therefore, be content. Look on me, for it is evident unto you if I lie. Return, I pray you, let it not be iniquity. Yet return again. My righteousness is in it. Is there any iniquity in my tongue? Cannot my taste discern perverse things? That's the end of chapter 6. And chapter 7, he starts off saying, is there not an appointed time to man upon the earth? Are not his days also like the days of a hireling? As a servant earnestly desires the shadow. That's like the shadow of the clock going down so that the shadow disappears, sort of like a sundial type idea, because the servant waits for that because he can rest in the evening. And as the hireling looks for the reward of his work, so am I made to possess months of vanity. So it seems as Job has already been suffering for months before the arrival of these friends. And wearisome nights are appointed to me, he says. When I lie down, I say, when will I arise, and when will the night be gone? I am full of tossings to and fro until the dawning of the day. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and has become loathsome. So he's talking about his horrible condition now, and we heard he had terrible boils and sores all over his body. Clods of dirt are clinging to the sores where they would begin to dry up and just hang there. You know, his flesh all over is just loathsome, he's saying. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is wind. Mine eye shall no more see good. The eye of him that hath seen me shall see me no more. Thine eyes are upon me, and I am not. As the cloud is consumed and vanishes away, so is he that goeth down to the grave. He shall come up no more. Again, he's talking about death, and he really doesn't know what he's saying here. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more. Therefore I will not refrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I a seed or a whale that you set a watch over me? A King James Version here says whale, but the Hebrew word is tanin, which is usually translated as dragon. So it means some big sea serpent or marine monster, a dinosaur here. It says, when I say my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint, then you come along and try to scare me with your dreams, and you terrify me through your vision, so that my soul chooses strangling and death rather than my life. I loathe it. I would not live always. Let me alone, for my days are empty. What is man that you should magnify him? So let me say at this point, Job is turned from Eliphaz, and he said, just leave me alone. I will choose to strangle on my own spittle rather than hear any more of your words. Death is better than life. So Job's discerning that the spirit that came to Eliphaz could not have been sent from God. Rather, it was intended merely to frighten him into blaspheming against the God he trusted, to get him to curse God and turn away, just as we know Satan said he was going to try to do. And then he turns to God in verse 17 of chapter 7 here, and addressing himself to God, he says, what is man that you should magnify him, and that you should set your heart upon him? Well, it's an interesting question. What is man that God should exalt him, and that God should set his heart upon man? I like the hymn we'll be singing next at the end. And can it be that I should gain an interest in the Savior's blood? Died he for me who caused his pain? That's a hymn we'll sing. I sometimes like to think that, or even maybe sing it to myself in the mirror. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? So you ought to sing that in the mirror to yourself sometime. Job's sort of doing that here, saying, God, what is man that you should magnify him, or that you should set your heart upon him? What am I that God should set his heart upon me? That God should desire my love, that God should desire my fellowship, that God should desire my responses to him. It's amazing, the mysteries of God, and sometimes we just can't fully understand them. And coming to the end of chapter 7 here, he says, and that you should visit him every morning and try him every moment. How long wilt you not depart from me, nor let me alone till I swallow down my spittle? I have sinned. What shall I do unto thee? It sounds like he's using another picturesque phrase for death. I began to just swallow my own spit. That's it. I can't cough it up anymore. I'm gone. I've sinned. What shall I do unto thee, O thou preserver of men? Why have you set me as a mark against thee, so that I am a burden to myself? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away mine iniquity? For now shall I sleep in the dust, and thou shalt seek me in the morning, but I shall not be. So his complaint to God, why don't you forgive me, God? Why don't you relieve me of this? What's going on? Well, it's Job crying out of his misery, basically. And he's going to need to wait a while to get a good answer from God, which we'll hear later. That's about all we have time for today. Homework for next week, read Job 8 through 10. Amen? Amen. Amen.